Thank you for listening to the Red Eye podcast. You guys are why we do this. We love the stories that you have, and we love telling you the stories that people share with us. To help us reach more people and get the podcast really out there, we would really appreciate it if you left a review. It just helps our podcast be a little bit more visible. Thank you. Okay, well, it does seem these days that a month can't go by without a good old naughty pilot story slipping into our DMs or spilling out at the hotel bar. And for this month, we've got one for you that was gifted to our writer by the philanderer himself. In his own words, he used to be a bit of a shagger. His phrase, not ours, delivered with a heavy sigh, a faraway look, and the slow twisting of his wedding band in that way only time and hindsight can bring. Well, we all have a past, don't we? And we at the Red Eye certainly aren't here to judge. Sir, if your memories help you through the mundanity of middle age and you're now dutifully towing the line like the rest of us, then more power to you. But let's be honest, the subjects of your adventures don't seem to have felt quite so charitable at the time. Doors to armed and cross-check. Come fly the Red Eye! Whoa! Welcome aboard the Red Eye. London Heathrow, 1999. Warren swaggered through the doors of check-in, carrying himself with that walk he'd perfected in the Air Force. The kind that came naturally when you wore all the paraphernalia of a flight suit. He flashed his practiced grin at the two girls behind the desk and felt a surge of satisfaction when the cheeks of the blonde one flushed. He'd been working on her for weeks, and he could tell that his charm was finally starting to win her over, like it usually did. Warren Gray was just 2 years out of the forces, and so far, the laid-back world of civilian flying was like a dream come true. Away from the grueling rules and overzealous superiors, he'd finally found a true joy in life. And, as a single man in his early 30s, the airlines certainly came with plenty of perks. Not least in the female form. "Morning, ladies," he said smoothly, signing the sheet on the desk with his flight written at the top. "Morning, Warren," they replied in unison. The other girl was older, wiser, and the smile she gave him back was more of one of amusement. Like she saw him and exactly who he was. But that was fine too. Warren wasn't here to make enemies. He just loved women. He loved everything about all of them. Well, except the ones in the Air Force. The ones with more testosterone than him, that was. The older one handed him a folder with his flight plans, NOTAMs, and everything else the pilots would need. "Captain not here yet?" he asked. "No, you're the first pilot in," she said. "You're early." He looked at his watch and shrugged. He only had to commute from St Albans, but it was that funny time of day where if he left just 20 minutes later and hit rush hour, he'd be late. And, well, he was always happy to come and hang out in the crew room and make some new, friends. "I'll wait for them in there," he said, heading across to the room opposite. He was just warming up his target, working on the new recruit with the red hair, who just so happened to be on his flight, when the door to the crew lounge swung open and his captain, Gary, walked in. Gary Trent was a man of legend at the airline and at the Air Force beforehand. Most of the pilots here had followed a similar path, but Gary was 20 years further along it than Warren. His hair was grey, like his skin, his nose a roadmap of red spider veins, and his stomach bulged over his waistband. No doubt he would regale them later with stories from when he was a young stud, not realising the fear that it would instill in his first officers that one day they would look like him. But Warren was still happy to see him. Pleased to know the cockpit conversations could be as off-colour as they wanted to go, and no one would be offended, because they were all cut from the same cloth. Some just wore a little bit more of it than others. "Gary," Warren said, springing to his feet and shaking his hand. "Ah, good to see you, lad." Gary gave him a fatherly smile. "Shall we head over for a brief? Got a lot to get through. Some weather on the way over, apparently." And that was that. Gary followed Warren into a small side room. Soon they were joined by the other two first officers, and by the time they came out, the crew had all assembled and were having their own briefing in another room. Warren never saw who was on his crew, nor did he see the trouble ahead of him. And it wasn't the weather. It was so windy in the car park that Fiona had given up trying to tame her hair. She'd just sort it out when she was safely indoors. A plane roared overhead the bus stop, and she rolled her eyes as another gust of air pulled at her French pleat. I'm going to look like I've been dragged through a hedge by the time we get there, she said, turning to the girl who had just arrived behind her. You and me both, babe, the girl replied, her blonde bob whipping in her face. Where are you off to? Hong Kong, Sydney, Fiona replied. You? Oh, me too. I'm Catherine. You? Fiona. Pleased to meet you. Any plans for Hong Kong? Oh, maybe a daiquiri in the Feather Boa, a few more in Insomnia, and then some air guitar in Dusk Till Dawn. Fiona tipped her head back and laughed. Oh, well, that's two of us. Hopefully we'll get a good crew. Oh, I'm sure we will, Catherine said, stepping close to the curb as the bus rumbled up. Never had a bad Hong Kong yet. The girls were still deep in conversation about the trip as they got to check-in, joining the short queue to sign their sheet. Where are you going? The girl behind the desk asked over the shoulder of the person ahead. Hong Kong, said Fiona. The girl slid the Hong Kong sheet to the side, and Fiona stepped forward, scanning down the list of names to find her own. One particular name caught her eye, and it lingered there for a second. 3 names down the list, under the captain's name and one more pilot's, was Warren Baker, first officer. She felt her stomach dip, knowing exactly what that meant for her, and for this week-long trip. It meant that she wouldn't be sleeping alone. She never did when she flew with Warren, not for the past 6 or 7 times they'd flown together anyway. It meant that she had another chance to win him over too. Oh, she was always so close to it, but it always felt like she was just a bit too early, that he wasn't quite ready to carry things on at home, to make any sort of commitment. She was okay with that, but deep down she would love to have more with him one day. Perhaps, she thought hopefully, in the couple of months since she'd seen him last, things might have changed. Not that they ever had before. She signed her name and handed the pen over her shoulder to Catherine. Right, I need to go and sort my hair out, she said, making her way out to where the toilets were. There was no way she was going to bump into Warren looking like a scarecrow. Catch you in a bit, Catherine called after Fiona as she leaned over the sheet to scan for her own name. Her hand froze above the list, suspended just as Fiona's had been moments before. There it was. His name. Warren Baker. Her stomach gave a small jolt. How would that not come up when they'd spent the night together in New York just last week? Then again, neither of them had asked. Maybe they had both known it was nothing more than just too much booze and a hazy mistake best left in another city, despite what a good time they'd both had. But now, he was, on her crew again. Not just for one night either, but for a full week. Hong Kong and Sydney lay ahead of them, and with it, the chance to find out whether that night had been nothing at all, or something worth pursuing. The truth was, Catherine had told herself, and everyone that knew her, was that she didn't want to be tied down. She'd been in the same relationship since school until her mid-20s, and the year since they'd split had really opened her eyes to the fun she'd been missing out on. But there had been something about Warren that had piqued her interest. Their time in New York had been brief, but the chemistry between them had been something she had never had with anyone before. And, if she was honest with herself, she didn't mind investigating it further on this trip. A small smile tugged at her lips as she signed her name, and there was a spring in her step as she crossed to the crew lounge. He wasn't there yet, but she was quite certain that he would be pleased to see her. Well, the banter had already started in the briefing, and the jet bridge echoed with deep, raucous laughter as the 4 pilots walked along it to the plane. The crew had already boarded ahead, and the glow of the cabin was warm and inviting against the darkness outside the windows. Warren stifled his laugh as Gary and the others stepped onto the plane ahead of him. They each greeted whoever was at the door until it was his turn, and Warren opened his mouth to say good evening, and then paused as he recognised the girl who stood there with a huge grin on her face. "Surprise!" she yelled, throwing her arms around him like a long-lost friend. Warren played into it and hugged her back, realising exactly what she would be expecting from him on the trip. It wasn't the worst-case scenario, although his thoughts about the redhead from earlier were somewhat quashed. "Fiona," he said, confirming the name with a quick look at her name badge. He'd been caught out like that before, and he didn't risk names unless he was 100% sure these days. "Wow, I fancy seeing you here. I had no idea you were on this." "Same," she said. Her stance was one of friendship, but the look she gave him said that they both knew what was in store for them. Fiona had become a regular of Warren's, and it was an easy gig. No reeling in needed. No unnecessary charm offensive. There were worse prospects for a long trip, and as the redhead walked past in the opposite aisle, he made a mental choice to take the easy path. "See you in a bit," he said, giving her a small wink and releasing himself from her grip. "Shame it's not a 3-man flight deck," Fiona whispered as she pulled back. It wasn't often that Warren blushed, but he felt his cheeks warm as he walked away. On their last flight, she'd surprised him on his crew rest. But the fact that there would be 2 pilots in the flight deck crew rest at any one time tonight meant that wouldn't be happening again. And that was really a shame. He shook his head, trying to rid it of distracting thoughts as he walked up to the flight deck. As the carpet of the aisle ended, he stepped into the bright galley and looked briefly at the girl in the galley. "Hey," she said. Something about the familiarity in her voice made him look again, and then he forced a smile onto his face as he clenched his buttocks tightly. "Hello, you," he said, trying to stay smooth, trying to stay cool. "Fancy seeing you here." The girl gave him a sultry smile, but said nothing while he racked his brains for her name. Joe? Jenna? Katie? No, Catherine. That was it, Catherine. He flicked his eyes down to her breast to find her name badge to confirm, but she wasn't wearing one. "How have you been?" he asked, aiming for neutral conversation so that he didn't slip up. They'd been together recently, and he had a strong feeling that it was New York a week or so ago, but he couldn't be certain enough to reference it. "Oh, good. You?" She turned away to sort some things on the galley side, still smiling like they were sharing a secret. "Any plans for Hong Kong?" She shot him a sultry look that told him exactly what she was thinking, and his butt cheeks clenched even harder. Warren's pulse hammered as his predicament hit him. 2 girls were both expecting to share his bed with him, and, unless perhaps they were both happy to share or join in, and he doubted they would be, he could feel one hell of an awkward trip ahead. A whole week of dodging what could only end in a car crash. "Oh, just the usual," he said. He tried to muster an enigmatic grin that she could translate however she wanted without him committing to anything. He turned to the open cockpit door. "See you in a bit," he said, retreating quickly through it. Gary squinted up at him from the captain's seat, the corners of his mouth twitching. "You okay, mate? You look like you've seen a ghost." Warren slumped into his chair, tossing his flight bag down by his feet. "Not a ghost," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. Worse. A double booking. Gary raised an eyebrow. Go on. Warren glanced at the cockpit door, then leaned in with a grimace. Let's just say I might have entertained both a Fiona and a Catherine recently, and they've only gone and both turned up on the same bloody trip. Gary let out a bark of laughter that rattled the overhead panel. You daft sod. A week with 2 cabin crew waiting to skin you alive. Oh, this'll be the best entertainment I've had in years. Warren dropped his head into his hands. Yeah, I'm glad you're enjoying it, Captain. Meanwhile, I'm about to spend a week dodging landmines. He'd done well the first night. Stayed in the hotel bar, watched the others head off to Lan Kwai Fong with a promise to follow, and then slipped back to his room, alone. Night 1 survived. But night 2, well, that one called too loudly. As the gins flowed and the rest of the crew joined them, eager for a big night out, Warren found himself swept along with the tide of pilots and cabin crew spilling from the hotel into taxis. The 2 girls barely spared him a glance, and he made sure to stay fully ensconced amongst the other pilots at all times, beginning to feel like maybe this trip was just about survivable. The Feather Boa throbbed with loud music. Its dim lights and opulent decor gave the place a boudoir vibe as they filed past the low tables and straight to the bar. Crew IDs flashed for discounts, and everyone stacked 3 deep at the small bar, ordering martinis and daiquiris, each with the signature chocolate rim. What do you boys want? Gary asked, nodding toward Warren and Ray, one of the other pilots. Just a beer for me, mate, said Warren. He had a feeling he'd had enough already. It was past midnight locally, though with the time difference, the sun would rise before most of the others had even thought about bed. Same here, said Ray. I'm just heading to the loo, he added before walking off. Before Warren even realised he was alone, Catherine was standing right in front of him. He returned her smile while his eyes flicked behind her, scanning for danger. So, fancy repeating New York in Hong Kong? She said, locking eyes with him. Maybe, Warren replied, his voice faltering as her hand slid to his hips. He pulled back slightly, hoping no one would notice. Normally he wouldn't have minded. He never minded anyone seeing his wins, but he knew enough about Fiona to be cautious. She had voiced her opinions about crew she didn't like enough times behind the bedroom door over post-coital cigarettes. She wasn't the type to be wound up lightly. Catherine, oblivious to her competition, stepped closer again. We could go back now if you like. Warren stalled, just as Gary appeared with beers in hand. A timely rescue. Cheers, pal, he said, reaching out for his drink. Relief washed over him as Catherine's hand dropped and she stepped back. Catch you later, he added, immediately regretting the words as she smiled and winked as if they'd been a promise. He took a long sip of his beer and shook his head. Trouble brewing? Gary asked, an amused glint in his eye. Not yet, Warren said, his gaze sliding across the bar to Fiona, who was sitting upright and shooting daggers at Catherine while she laughed obliviously with the others. But it might be coming soon, he added. It was sooner than he'd hoped. Perhaps 20 minutes and 2 more drinks before he saw the 2 girls close enough to spell danger. Fiona hadn't spoke to him at all night. Just the normal looks that they'd share on other trips, while knowing that they'd end up in bed together later. The looks that she was giving him had stayed the same, but the ones that she was shooting Catherine, especially after she'd come to speak to him twice more, had become more and more icy. Now, from a distance, as they stood apparently talking, he could see the air around the two of them turn icy. He watched with a clenched jaw as Catherine took a step backwards and Fiona followed. The group around them all seemed to notice at once and moved back, creating space around them. Then, in slow motion, he watched in horror as Fiona's arm pulled back and then she lunged forward, throwing her daiquiri straight in the face of a shocked Catherine. But it didn't end there. Oh, if only it had. Catherine stood her ground for a second before reaching down to the table by her side, grabbing the fullest glass on it and throwing it back over Fiona. Without missing a beat, Fiona stepped forward and shoved Catherine, sending her crashing into the table, the sound of smashing glass plunging everyone else into silence. From the pilot group, Warren stood and watched open-mouthed, until he felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Gary looking at him with a face of concern.
"I think you'd better go back to the hotel, lad," he said.
Warren nodded, shooting one more look over to where the flight manager was now stood between the two girls, trying to calm things down, while a barmaid shrieked at them in Mandarin. Sure that neither of them were looking his way, Warren ran from the bar and was in the taxi quicker than a bank robber into his getaway car.
"Park Lane, mate,"
he said, hurriedly, casting a look over his shoulder to make sure that no one was following, and sinking back into the seat with relief when he was sure that they weren't. Well, not quite yet, anyway. He'd only been in his room an hour before the door knocked. He was still wide awake, from the jet lag and the adrenaline of it all, and was just minding his own business, trying to wind down with some TV, when he heard the rap, rap, rap on the wood. He got up slowly, not wanting to make any noise in case it was trouble that was knocking. And he was right, because on the other side of the spy hole was trouble in the form of Fiona. Even through the concave glass, he could see that she was raging, and he stepped back from the door, inexplicably afraid of what she might do. "Warren," she said quietly, her smooth voice attempting to lull him into a false sense of security. "Let me in." He said nothing. On any other trip, he would have opened the door in a heartbeat. But after what he'd just witnessed, he wasn't about to find out if she wanted to throw things at him too. In his defense, he'd never given her any reason to think that they were exclusive. But whatever Catherine had told her had got her all riled up, and she was clearly on the warpath. She knocked again. "Warren, I know you're in there," she said, her voice deceivingly sweet. He stepped back further and sat on the edge of his bed. She knocked harder. And then she shouted, "Warren, let me in now, or I'll scream the corridor down." Warren felt the blood drain to his feet, and he clutched the side of his mattress. "Warren!" Her voice got louder every time she shouted his name, until she really was screaming. "Warren, you two-timing prick! Let me in now, or you'll regret it!" Whew. Well, that one made him laugh, inwardly, in a gallows humour kind of way, but still, he stayed silent, refusing to answer, afraid of adding any fuel to her fire. Warren! But the knocking just got louder, and the screaming just got shriller, until, finally, after what seemed like an hour, but was probably more like 10 minutes, he heard her protesting loudly as she was escorted off by security. The phone ringing the next morning jolted Warren from a fitful sleep. He fumbled in the dark room for it, putting the receiver to his ear without even opening his eyes.
"Mate, you need to keep it in your trousers."
Warren rubbed his eyes, momentarily confused by the blunt subject of the wake-up call.
"First, The whole crew has been banned from the Feather Boa because of your two girls smashing the place up. Then I have to meet security in the early hours and persuade one of the nutcases to stay in her room. And now I've got the other one so upset she's apparently refusing to fly to Sydney this afternoon. Maybe it's time you just settled the fuck down and found a wife, mate.
Warren pushed himself up in the bed and stretched his cheek down with his hand as he listened to the trouble that he had left in his wake. "I am so sorry," he apologised when Gary had finished, choosing to ignore his unnecessary comment about settling down. "I did try and avoid them both, I really did." On the other end of the phone, he heard what he thought was laughter.
Honestly, it's the funniest trip I've had in months. No need to apologise. You should have seen it, though, after you left. Bloody carnage!
Gary's laughter bubbled up, and Warren allowed himself a small smile, although his was more from relief than amusement. Gary took a deep breath to calm himself.
Just try and avoid them both for the rest of the trip, eh?
"Avoid them? I'm coming in disguise," Warren laughed back, wondering as he hung up the phone how on earth he was going to survive another 3 sectors without one of them, most probably Fiona, hurting him. Yes, he'd be avoiding them for 3 sectors, and every flight he ever did in the future. In fact, he'd be avoiding every pretty girl he'd ever flirted with or dallied with, just in case 2 of them ever ended up on the same crew again. Ugh, maybe he should just avoid airline women altogether. It'd been fun, sure, but now he'd seen exactly how quickly the tables could turn, and he wasn't even out of danger yet. There was still a full week of this madness to go. Warren groaned and sank back into his pillow, replaying Gary's words in his head. Maybe the old grey-haired captain was right. Maybe he was even speaking from his own experience. Perhaps it really was time for Warren Baker to pack away the charm, hang up the flirting, and finally find himself a wife. He chuckled softly and shook his head. One day, maybe. But, not quite yet.
The Red Eye Podcast is written by Kaylee Kay, narrated and produced by me, Ali Murphy. These stories are based on true events, but certain details, characters, and timelines have been altered to protect the innocent. Visit our website, theredeyepod.com, to subscribe to our newsletter and to find out details on how you can contribute your story for us to turn into an episode. If you enjoyed listening to our stories, please like, subscribe, and review. Thank you.
Our author, Kaylee Kay, does an incredible job of taking these true stories and turning them into fun little episodes for the Red Eye Podcast. But did you know she's already written 6 novels, and they are amazing? So if you want to read those, visit Amazon and search for Kaylee Kay, and I'll put a link in the show notes too.